This is the first section of our kind of little series that we're trying to do on a book called Mistaken Identity by Assad Haider. Book's been out for a little while. It's the subtitle is like Identity in the Age of Trump. So it's like maybe a little bit dated in that kind of way. But the material that it goes over and kind of like I think the way that he writes it especially is like really accessible and just like remains like really applicable, even though we obviously have Trump isn't the president anymore. The age of Trump, or the age of bourgeois supremacy, is still equally as applicable. So yeah, I'm gonna just like kick off maybe a little bit different and use just a lot of like excerpts and block quotes because I think that Haider's writing is really great and really accessible. And I guess I kept on finding myself like trying to kind of like summarize his words and thinking like, damn, he just says it so much better than I could say it. Like, why don't you just quote him? So that's what I'm gonna do a little more of. So yeah. The first kind of like little excerpt that I have was where does identity come from? Is kind of the rhetorical question. This is on I think the 19th page. And these institutions, collectivities of people are separated into individuals who are subordinated to a dominating power. By this individualization but this institutionalization also constitutes them as political subjects. The basic political unit of liberalism, after all, is the individual. Within this framework, Judith Butler, who he's talking about, Butler argues the assertion of rights and claims to entitlement can only be made on the basis of a singular and injured identity. The word subject, Butler points out, has a particular double meaning. It means having agency, being able to exert power, but also being subordinated under the control of an external power. The liberal form of politics is one in which we become subjects who participate in politics through our own subjection to power. So that's kind of the end of the excerpt, and these are some of my words. Liberal individuality becomes a cyclical framework of oppression as that which gives one political being while also dooming one to only being defined in its subjugation. The hammer defines the nail, and so forth. Butler offers that the beginning of a political framework of changing is refusing the type of individuality correlated with the disciplinary apparatus of the modern state. But how can we achieve this if we take these forms of identity for granted? If we accept individual identity as the starting point of our analysis and our politics, the most we can hope for is a well-managed condition of subjugation to our prescribed identities, a crystal clear recognition, understanding, and articulation of the shackles around each other's necks, as opposed to posing questions of liberation, questions about how do we end oppression? How do I remove the shackles from around our necks? Participating in politics with a revolutionary materialist program is to go from the abstract to the concrete. It has to bring this abstraction back to earth, the abstraction of identities specifically. It has to bring this abstraction back to earth by moving through all the historical specificities and material relations that have put it into our heads. That is to interact not with just the abstraction, but the material circumstances that have given rise to that abstraction. If we ever hope to build a movement with enough power to push the masses into their own historical driving seat, we must first aspire to it. Recognition for an injured identity within bourgeois institutions cannot possibly describe this movement's scope or its aspirations. So that's what I had on that little excerpt. And then I had another excerpt on something that Assad Haider is quoting Huey P. Newton as talking about reactionary nationalism. And Huey P. Newton is distinguishing revolutionary nationalism, which he describes as being the masses being in charge. The kind of pretty closely related to like the dictatorship of the proletariat, when the masses have the ability to democratically decide their own fate. And then he also describes reactionary nationalism, something the Black Panther Party came up against a lot. And he talks about it. As Newton pointed out, reactionary nationalism put forth an ideology of racial identity, but it was also based on a material phenomenon. Desegregation had made it possible for Black businessmen and politicians to enter into the American power structure on a scale that had not been possible before. And these elites were able to use racial solidarity as a means of covering up their class positions. If they claimed to represent a unitary racial community with a unified interest, they could suppress the demands of Black working people whose interests were, in reality, entirely different from theirs. If you talked about racism without talking about capitalism, you weren't talking about getting power in the hands of the people. You were setting up a situation in which the white cop would be replaced by the Black cop. This is not to say that desegregation was a bad thing, or Black politicians having more of a say in their communities is somehow inherently bourgeois. Rather, it is the separation of the two critiques of saying that racism doesn't depend on capitalism and that capitalism doesn't depend on racism that's wrong. This is where the fault lies, that as long as Black people have agency, representation, and participation in public and private institutions, then that is merely enough, and it's not. There must be an understanding that these two seemingly separate struggles, economic and racial oppression, are actually the same struggle, and then to act accordingly. As the Combahee River Collective stated, we understood that coalition building was crucial to our own survival, that solidarity was crucial. To quote Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, the most significant transformation in all of Black life over the last 50 years has been the emergence of a Black elite, bolstered by the Black political class that has been responsible for administering cuts and managing meager budgets on the backs of Black constituents. If we are ever going to be able to untangle the mess of this material history, we have to start by drawing a line of demarcation between the emancipatory mass movements of the past, the Black Panthers, the Civil Rights Movement, which struggled against racism, and the contemporary ideologies of identity, which are attached to the politics of a multiracial elite. We could see, the politics of the Obamas or the politics of Al Sharpton. We could see examples of that. When identity claims are put forth without a grounding in a critique of capitalism, Brown suggests, that's Wendy Brown, suggests identity politics concerned with race, sexuality, and gender will appear not as a supplement to class politics, not as an expansion of left categories of oppression and emancipation, not as an enriching augmentation of progressive formulas of power and persons, all of which they also are, but as tethered to a formulation of justice that reinscribes a bourgeois ideal as its measure. If it is not questioned, people of color, along with other oppressed groups, have no choice but to articulate their political demands in terms of inclusion in the bourgeois masculine ideal. That is to normalize that ideal and solidify its permanence in that way. So that's all I had for the first chapter. And then the second chapter, I was going to use kind of a longer excerpt where the author talks about his experiences organizing around tuition hikes at UC Santa Cruz right around 2014. In the 1990s, we grew accustomed to the idea that every marginalized identity's claim to recognition must be recognized and respected, a form of discursive etiquette sometimes summed up in the buzzword intersectionality, a term originating in legal studies which now has an intellectual function compared to abracadabra or dialectics. Oh, that's funny. When Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the term in 1989, it had a precise and delimiting meaning. Crenshaw began with an examination of how courts frame and interpret the stories of Black women plaintiffs. She cited cases in which courts determined that an anti-discrimination lawsuit must be examined to see if it states a cause of action for race discrimination, sex discrimination, or alternatively either, but not a combination of both, right? Which we would call intersectionality, which is really fucking important. She went on to link this specific legal question to the general problem already described by the Combahee River Collective, that single issue political frameworks would end up centering the most privileged members of a group, marginalizing those whose identities expose them to other forms of subordination. In its campus activist usage, however, intersectionality appears to move in the opposite direction. Retreating from the coalition building practices of the CRC, the Combahee River Collective, and instead generalizing the condition of the plaintiff. Those whose identity is inscribed with the most intersecting lines can claim the status of most injured and are therefore awarded in the juridical framework to which politics is now reduced, both discursive and institutional protection. This protected status implies neither political subjectivity that can come from organizing autonomously, nor the solidarity that is required for coalitions that can engage in successful political action. Indeed, the immediate reaction to the attempt by student radicals to organize around police violence was to question whether a group which was not Black identified, the police violence of Michael Brown, this is like Ferguson BLM round one, was to question whether a group which was not Black identified should even be permitted to address the issue. As a result, Black identified groups staged a couple of ephemeral die-ins, while the radical coalition, which included at a minimum Black, white, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Indian, Iranian, and Jewish activists, dwindled in size. This played out organizationally all over the country, with Black separatists and exceptionalism, separatism and exceptionalism as an assumed starting point. At marches many of us attended in Oakland, the rallies were led by politicians and nonprofit bureaucracies who warned of white outside agitators who might try to instigate violence. They said that only Black people should take the mic, that only Black people should take leadership roles, that Black people should be at the front of the march with white allies last and brown people allowed in the middle. Brown in this context presumably refers to everyone excluded by the governing categories of Black and white. In practice, with our demographic terrain, it encompassed the majority of our immigrant population. Given that, as Marie Gotchkalt writes in the Boston Review, the carceral state has dramatically expanded its capacity to apprehend, detain, punish, and deport immigrants. It is hard not to react with some confusion to the suggestion that they can only play a literal secondary role in movements that target the criminal justice system.